Hi, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in our second Meet the Author series. Today is very exciting. I am thrilled to have Jan Molino join me. I'm Jen Dalton, and we're going to be talking about women and difficult conversations in leadership positions, managing up, managing sideways, etc. And so, as we think about difficult conversations, which is really the crux of why I wrote this book, is we need to practice having difficult conversations. And there's a whole chapter in my book, "Listen: How to Embrace the Difficult Conversations Life Throws at Us," on women in leadership. And so, it's important as we go through the session today, jump in, ask questions, chime in. Obviously, we're on Facebook Live. You can also join us on YouTube Live as well. And so, with that, let me introduce Jan Molino. She's a good friend. I've gotten to know her over the last year, and it's been very exciting. She's the president and CEO of Aspire Ascend, and they're a consulting firm. She does a lot of work coaching women on helping them find the right career and leadership roles, but also on board leadership development, on executive development services. And so, if you're interested in being on boards, if you need help in getting on boards, if you're working on your presence and communication, she is fantastic. And so, with that, let me welcome Jan. It's great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This is exciting. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
We've spent a lot of time uh, working together in women groups and having
Yeah.
great dialogue around leadership. And so, what's one of the key things that jumps out for you that are challenges that women face in leadership roles when it comes to difficult conversations today?
Well, the first things that come out to me are, the difficult conversations are already, around promotions, salary and benefits, management style, leadership. And the thing that happens is that women don't often put themselves out there and ask for that raise or the new project or the promotion. So they still kind of get in their own way and wait for things to come to them instead of asking for them.
I definitely agree. It's interesting when I interviewed um, women for the book, and there are men and women interviewed and featured in the book, but specifically for this chapter,
Uh-huh.
both of the women I interviewed were very unique. They dove in and asked and did all of these brave, provocative things, which is why I loved capturing that interview. And so, as you think about let's pick one of those examples. When it comes to an organization and pursuing those difficult conversations,
Uh-huh.
what's an example of an organizational issue? Maybe the organization isn't ready to talk about women in leadership, or they don't know how to handle it. Or what's a conversation that you might see that's keeping women back that they need to be ready to have?
Well, the funny part is that we assume that organizations are women friendly, quite frankly. And so we need to first find out if there's the infrastructure in place for women to succeed. And so when you don't have a lot of women at the top of the organization, that's a huge sign. And so let's just say you're joining an organization and you want to ask questions. I mean, you need to understand, don't assume that an organization is female friendly just because they have one person in that entire organization. And it's really hard. And I think that having those conversations, learning how to work um, with people that are difficult to work with, or having that conversation to get that raise, I think there are employee tools that need to empower women in their careers in organizations. And those employee tools can be hands-on exercises. They can be individual or group meetings. Um, and I think the other part are workshops. But I have always found that women in organizations need to have these kind of workshops and put together a career path for themselves. And that starts you to have confidence to be able to ask for yourself, to advocate for yourself.
So you brought up looking at an organization from the outside. Let's say you're in an interview, and interviews really are two-way street, right? You're interviewing the company to see if it's a good fit and vice versa. What are some questions that women can ask in interviews to tease out the culture and to understand how does the company think about diversity? How do they think about women in leadership? And what are some of the initiatives that they have going on?
It's really funny that of all of the industries, and every one of us, every industry has its issues, but the biggest one is the tech industry. It's just male dominated, and so many women end up in companies with an environment that actually perpetrates discrimination, and at some point, they're going to walk into it in their careers. So there are three areas you really should ask about. You should have a question ready about work, a question ready about the people, and a question ready for the culture. So if you're talking about people, you can ask a question that says, well, this looks like a really great place, but how often do people get to ask questions about how the organization runs? It'll be interesting to hear what they have to say about that. Um, in regards to people, are there women on this team? What positions do women hold in these organizations, and what kind of people are successful here? And I think if you're looking at culture, which I think is the most important question, it's what kind of things do team members do together besides work? Or what made you decide to work here?
I
And
love I love those questions. Well, as you were talking and I was thinking about, you know, organizations can have a women's group. They can have a African American group, they can have an Asian group, but are people that are not of that background demographic, are they showing up, right? Is it a CEO-led initiative? How is the CEO chiming in? So in your experience, what are some best practices for leadership teams, executive teams, or CEOs to do to help promote diversity? And, you know, if they're not promoting diversity, I mean, we all know if it doesn't start at the top, it's not going to happen. So, what would you recommend for CEOs who are just starting on this journey? What should they consider? What should they think about? What can they do to get the ball rolling?
well, you mentioned that each diversity group has its own group. And in that, you will have women. So women are now in like maybe 5 groups. And what there isn't is a gender equity group. And so gender equity, gender diversity is actually a very powerful forum, a women's leadership forum for the organization. So I'm hopeful that that'll be more part of the plan than a last thought. But CEOs really need to take a look at putting together a comprehensive strategy of women's advancement that is ingrained throughout the entire organization and the culture. And it all starts at the top, as you said. And so strong CEOs and their top management make a real commitment to gender diversity. And it's actually expressed as a priority in this organization, and that it's monitored, it's measured, and it's supported throughout the entire organization. And Jen, unfortunately, most of these things start in human resources and then they get lost. So it has to start at the top.
So let's take this example and pivot a little bit from an organizational conversation to a one-on-one conversation. Let's say you're a woman in a leadership role and you're trying to have this discussion either with your CEO if you're not the CEO
Uh-huh.
or with your manager, period, about diversity or even just a general question about performance. You mentioned promotions earlier. We're heading
Mhm.
into the new year. These might be questions on people's mind about how do I approach this conversation? And I know in my book, a lot of the conversations are with people we already know, like and trust. We already have a relationship.
Uh-huh.
We want to protect it. And so that's why a lot of people don't have these difficult conversations because they don't want to hurt the relationship. But what are your thoughts when it comes to, let's say, promotions or an ask that a woman might be pursuing going into the new year? What's a way to start that conversation? What does that look like?
Well, so depending on where you are in the organization, I'm going to answer this a little bit differently. I think it's about managing up. And so that is an art in itself, and it's critical to your success. And so Being able to manage up means that that's the difference between you getting recognized for your work and being able to get that new project or have an opinion or talk about a promotion, because you're able to show your boss or your leadership that you're keeping them informed on the progress. And I think that that skill is one of the first things that we have to learn as women, starting out as soon as we get into an organization, all the way up to the boardroom, and being proactive and seeking out new responsibilities. So you want to wait until the new year to find this new place in the organization. But what you need to do is find some solutions to some problems and identify new opportunities for business development. Let's just say that, or growth, and be seen as an asset to the team. But also, you need to take ownership. You need to take. Most women sit there and think everybody can see that I'm working. This is all good. No, you need to tell people how much you're doing. Um, you need to participate and add value. Speak up, give your ideas, be heard in meetings. And if that is not something you've done so far, and now you want to go for that promotion next year, these are the things you need to put in place to make yourself, one, be seen, and two, come across as confident and the new responsibility that you want.
So I would anticipate that a lot of people, there may be changes in who their leader is
Mm.
from this year, right? And we're also in a lot of our meetings are virtual. So one of the things I write about as sort of ahas from the book is be very self-aware, right? And so I think to
Yeah.
your point, have a real conversation with yourself first around what have you actually done to be transparent. As you said, telepathy is not a strategy. You've got to communicate your value. Um, I think, the other is to know your audience. So understand their communication style, understand how they might perceive you. What's a win-win for everybody? So sometimes I think women go into, or men too, go in to talk about a promotion and they're really thinking about themselves versus what does the organization need?
Mhm.
How can I help make that happen? So let's say you go into talk with your leadership manager. What are some of those communication styles? How can people think about navigating them? And then I want to pivot a little bit to what happens when conversations go sideways. But let's start off with you're in control for the moment. What are some of the styles that people can think about and prepare for?
It's interesting. We all have a style of communications that we prefer, or at least we think we prefer. And it's probably served us pretty well all these years, right? Or we wouldn't be where we are. But really, what I've learned over time, quite frankly, is that there are different types of styles of communications that will help you, particularly in difficult conversations, in difficult situations, in the C-suite and in the boardroom. And I know what my style is, at least I thought I did until I took my little quiz, and it turned out that I really wasn't as emotive as I thought I was. And what I practice and how I really am is different, and I ended up being more of a reflective style. So I think that I learned when I'm in a difficult situation to actually listen to somebody. How are they coming across to me? And then I have to adapt my style to theirs. So let me just give you an example. So emotive people are really enthusiastic. Um, and then you have the directive style, which most of us know they're pretty frank, they're pretty upfront, they're pretty assertive. Then the supportive style, which are, those are the people that, like, they'll persuade you. They don't use power. They're not in your face. And then last but not least is the reflective style. So they kind of think before they speak and they take in the entire situation. And when you're working, let's just say you're working with an emotive person and you're a reflective person. Well, you're not very, hands are not flying, you're not doing any of those things. So when you're speaking to somebody who's that emotive, what you want to do is, first of all, try to socialize with them. Um, don't give them a lot of details because they're not detail oriented people. Uh, be less formal, be more friendly with them. And then I know this is hard, but you have to share some feelings with them because that will connect the two of you together. And that's not always easy for people to do, you know?
Absolutely. When I've worked with leaders on communication style, giving them, and this came up last night too, in my interview with Danielle Robinson Bell around being able to name something. So if you understand your communication style,
Mhm.
um, let's say your leader is always asking about what's the budget, are we on time,
Mhm.
and you just want them once to ask you how's your weekend, how things were going. It's not personal. That's just their style. Um, and but it is important to know how do they communicate. It's mostly important about how do they receive information and
Exactly.
process it,
Exactly.
right? And so again, knowing your audience, understanding how they process information, what's going to
Mhm.
get their
Mhm.
attention. Do they like having an hour-long conversation or is it a 5-minute conversation? And again, don't take it personally if it is. Just know what that style is. Um, One of the things I recommend in the book is, before you go in and ask for a promotion or before you go in and maybe you are managing up and you want to persuade them to communicate differently or
Mhm.
help you find opportunities, is to prepare, right? To do
Mhm.
some scenario planning. Which direction could it go? And be ready to sort of navigate through those. Um, how do you recommend people do that? Do you have sort of tips and insights on once you do the scenario planning and you're in the meeting, what
Mhm.
are some of the best practices you have if things start to go sideways?
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. So let's just say you have somebody who's a very directive style person, okay? And you know right off they like a firm handshake. They like all of those pieces put together. And they are not going to ask you how your evening went or how's your mother or anything else. They just want to get straight to business. And having a conversation with them is difficult, quite frankly. Um, when it goes sideways, it's interesting. I can tell you that when I have dealt with a directive person and it's gone sideways, I just sit back and I just listen. And I honestly take on the reflective style. And so I am slowing my rate of speech. I am no hand gestures. I'm just like sitting there going, yes, and listening. I'm being reserved. I'm actually going to give them details and I'm not going to display any emotion. So when the conversation goes sideways, I actually will look at them and say, I understand where you're coming from. What do we need to do to fix this? What can we do? And I'm not taking the blame on myself either, by the way, because we as women usually take that right away and say, oh, what can I do to fix that?
Right.
And I think in this situation, when it's that conversation goes sideways, you really need to look at how both of you can fix it. At least that's my thoughts, anyhow.
No, absolutely. And I think from a brain standpoint and the research I've seen, the idea to step back, take a breath, listen,
Hmm.
and give yourself space to be calm,
Hmm.
and not to escalate, right? So it's really important. Don't escalate. If anything, try to de escalate by listening, observing, letting there be silence if there needs to be silence, right? Letting the person speak and not try to fill the gaps. Um, but listening is like the number one, step that I go towards when I'm just trying to figure out what do I say next? Where is
The
this
process,
headed?
yeah.
Right? And you're processing in the moment, trying to figure out, okay, is now the time to exit this conversation and wrap it up? Is there anything we can do to salvage it? Is there anything that we need to set expectations and say, gosh, here's where it sounds like we are. Maybe we need to step back and think about how we both can help move this forward. Let's talk later today or reconvene tomorrow. I mean, are those some strategies you see happen if it's more general coaching conversations? It may not be about a promotion or things like that, but if you're in a development conversation and let's say your boss or manager says, "Gosh, you haven't done what I expected you to do, and you think you did a great job," and there's
Mhm.
a real disconnect. Uh,
Mhm.
are those some of the best practices? What else would you recommend as far as pausing and setting expectations to catch up
Yeah.
again? Like, what do you think?
I just think that when you're in that kind of a situation, first of all, you can't be defensive. You just can't be defensive. So you really have to look at, you know what you did, and you also may know where they're coming from, he or she. But I think the biggest point, and I can tell you that I will say the same thing for people that are in interviews. When you find yourself in this position, close your mouth and just listen and wait and outwait them until they say the next sentence, because it could all blow over by then. And if you start to push back, you can end up in a very bad situation. Um, Sometimes when you're in an interview, the interviewer will ask you a provocative question and wait for you to walk right into that trap. Just shut up, sit back. I know it's the hardest thing in the world to do. It really is, because you're like, oh my God, inside. But you just need to just calm down and listen. And I tell that to every single person in a situation, because the more calm and control that you are, it diffuses the situation. It, I have never seen it not work. So I'm just going to go with that one.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we have folks chiming in and giving comments. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll tee them up as we can during the interview, but also we'll do Q&A at the end as well. Um, One of the things that I think is critical for women to think about is, from a development standpoint,
Mhm.
is sponsorship, is finding a champion, and I know we use different words for different things depending on who you're talking to.
Mm.
Sometimes that can be a stressful conversation. You're not sure how to ask. Um, you're nervous about it. Maybe it's someone you really look up to. What if they say no? And most people don't like being rejected. What are your thoughts about that specific ask? And then what are some other things women can do
Mhm.
from a development standpoint, conversations they should have, best practices?
Well, first of all, I am a true believer in sponsorship versus mentor. Mentors like your best friend saying, oh, that's great, go for it. A sponsor actually opens the door. They literally open the door for you. And whether it's for a promotion or advancement or a new project, they actually open the door and say, you know, Jan would make a really good director on this. You should really, let's bring her in and let's talk to her. This is something that is so natural among men. That's the difference, though. You know, Men don't have to sponsor or promote each other. That just happens naturally in the workplace. We women don't do that. We are our own worst enemies. And because there's so few of us in leadership positions, we don't want anyone else to get ahead of us. So sharing is a tough deal here. So getting that real sponsor, and um, I tell people to get a sponsor who is at least 2 levels above you. And I say that for a reason, because they can make things happen. If you're at the same level, you're vying for the very same position, right? Um,
Absolutely. Well, and
so,
you bring up a great point.
okay.
Um, and I wanted to tease this out because this came up in the book actually.
Mhm,
Um, let's say you work for a woman,
mhm,
and one of the big challenges for women is having women. I mean, it's getting men to support women, and it's also getting women to support women.
mm.
So, what does that conversation look like when you need to manage up and talk with your boss, male or female? But I think it's important also to talk about, the female piece. How do you broach that subject around, gosh, um, working better together, right? I'm always a big fan of positive messaging versus punitive or going on the defensive or even attacking, right? I don't think that's the right answer. Um, but what are your thoughts on how to start that conversation?
on on working with on
If you're
working with
working
female leaders.
with a woman, yeah, if you're working with someone in a senior position to you and they're not supporting you and they're sort of maybe they're not giving you visibility, maybe they're taking credit for your work. Like, what are some thoughts on how to approach that?
Well, I can tell you that those are very difficult conversations, particularly if they're taking the credit for it, for your work, or they're not giving you the accolades you need quite frankly. And that just shows you one big sign, though, that this person is not a great leader, because really good leaders are influencers. And influencers, as you know, influence drives every trend, everything that we look at today. So a good leader is a true influencer. So if you're working with somebody who is giving you a very difficult time, does not see where you're coming from, does not understand your work, it's a very difficult conversation. And honestly, the only thing you can do is speak up for yourself. I'm a big believer in speaking up for yourself and advocating for yourself, and bringing out some ideas, and confrontation is okay, quite frankly. It's just how you do it that's fine. I mean, if you're getting browbeat all the time, is this really the place you want to work? And maybe you can't leave. Maybe it's that type of situation. But at the end of the day, you need to advocate for yourself, and do need to be able to hear her evaluation of you, as well as what you think the situation was. But at the end of the day, you still need to advocate for yourself. I'm truly a big believer in that. It's just you just don't have to jump down somebody's throat either.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the book I talk about obviously preparing before a meeting, but I think it's really important to think about what are your goals? What do you really want to come out of the conversation with? And whatever the situation is, being really honest around how did I contribute? Right? How might I have contributed? What could they be thinking about? But don't get too wrapped up around the axle with making up
Yeah,
stories because we're good at
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Right? So to your point, going in and making it a check-in, you know, let's especially because we're going into the new year. What are the expectations for the year? How did I'd love to hear how you thought I did last year. Let's talk about what are the goals for this year, right? And making it a learning opportunity. I think if anyone approaches a conversation and they're trying to place blame or they're trying to win the conversation, you've already lost the conversation, right? It's really about dialogue. I mean, is that your experience? Is that what you see also?
Yeah, but I also think that when you're going in to have that conversation with somebody, that you generally know where you stand with them before you're having that conversation. And you need to have the answers to those questions before you walk in that room. You need to know that she or he is going to come at you at these three areas. And if you don't have a response for that, not in a defensive manner, but you need to know when you ask a question, you need to know the answer. And you need to be able to respond with that answer. And I think what is critical for women is learning how to have powerful conversations that and conversations are really kind of undervalued. So I think that we as women, in any situation, we need to speak to our truth in our real voice, and we need to be authentic, and we need to be confident. And I think that many times when we get in these situations, we're looking for validation instead of sharing our perspective. And so I think it's when you're speaking in these situations and having conversations, whether they're difficult, whether they go sideways or whatever, we need to ask powerful questions. We need to follow up. We need to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, which is giving feedback, solicited or unsolicited. And last but not least, asking for what we want.
When it comes to supporting women, I know you
Mhm.
mentioned earlier mentorship and sponsorship are different. I totally agree.
Mm.
Um, if someone is thinking about or wants to be a mentor in the new year, what are your thoughts or suggestions? How to go about that conversation? How to go about saying, I'd love to be your mentor? I mean, maybe they wanna mentor up. I mean, you can mentor up, down, sideways, like, what are some best practices before you assume that someone wants you as their mentor or that you can mentor them? What are some things you can ask in a conversation to help tease that out?
Well, you have people that report to you, hopefully, and you have young people that are coming into the organization. And what I found, and actually, we actually do this at Aspire Ascend, and we have a sponsorship program, an executive sponsorship program that starts at the C-suite. But the give back is that the person who's getting sponsored has to mentor two women.
I love that.
So you get to choose the two women. Nobody else is making the choices here. You choose two women to actually mentor and help them learn to navigate through the organization. Maybe they're new in the organization and they don't understand the politics. That politics is the culture of the organization. So mentoring is actually pretty critical for people up until your mid-career. And then starting at mid-career, you need to start looking for sponsors. And the way to look at that is look who's in the organization. And men can be sponsors too.
100%.
And so you look at that and you find a way to connect with them in a meeting, set up a call with them, send them an email, link in with them in LinkedIn, and actually talk with them about your career goals. And you love the way they work and you want to hear about their career. Would they be interested in help sponsoring you through the organization? And you actually have to explain that to them, by the way.
Mm.
I mean, it doesn't come naturally.
Don't assume that they know what it is.
No,
Right.
don't assume anybody knows what that means and say,
Yeah.
and sponsorship means that you're going to, most women in organizations, by the way, this is going off track a little bit. They're in three positions. They're in HR, they're a general counsel, or they're in marketing and communications. And you know what's equal about all of those? None of them have P&L.
They're all undervalued. They don't have a profit and loss.
But also they can't hurt the company in profit and loss because they don't have any. So when you're getting sponsored, you want to get into a position where you're going to actually be able to learn those critical skills. And so sometimes you may have to make a lateral move to do that. And that's important. And that's what a sponsor will help you do.
I know for me, when I was in portfolio management, project management, product management, process management, I've done all of the P's. And I've been in, obviously junior role to chief of staff and leading larger groups.
Mhm.
One of the most important things I did about halfway through my corporate career was join a board.
Mhm.
Because joining a board and getting on their finance committee, right? Getting involved and showing that expertise outside of the company if there wasn't that opportunity internally. Do you see that happening a lot? And for women who are looking for board opportunities as a way to help fill that expertise,
Mhm.
any thoughts or recommendations on pursuing that and what that ask looks like to the organization?
Yeah, definitely. I think women need to start looking at board work, whether they're starting in their mid career and really start looking. And they think that they have to wait for 10 or 20 years to get on the board. And that's just not necessarily true. Starting in mid career, you need to start looking at nonprofits and being able to serve on the board and look where your value is. What is the unique value proposition that you bring to this board? And how can you help them? And you also want to get on committees like you did on the finance committee or the audit committee or the whatever they call them, treasury. But really, what getting on a nonprofit is the best thing you can do for yourself. It also teaches you board governance, and that's where most people who go onto the boards get tripped up because they don't understand that component. And boards don't run the organization; they are the strategy component of the organization. And so, learning that early on in your career is the best thing you could do for yourself, because down the road, when you are looking at a paid board position or a corporate board position, you will need to ask your boss for permission because it will interfere with your work in some respects, because paid board seats are about 200 to 300 hours a year that you will actually have to work there. So having that good relationship inside the organization is critical.
I definitely think knowing what's in it for the company, right? So I'm
Oh,
going to join this
absolutely.
board. This is the community impact. This is how we can get visibility for the company. This is the skill set I'll learn, which I can reapply back to the business.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to say, a lot of my difficult conversations have been on boards too,
Mhm.
and especially where you don't have authority. And it is, as you said earlier, all about influence. Um, so let's dive in a little bit about best practices when it comes to having difficult conversations. So we talked earlier about listening,
Mhm.
um, and I want to tease that out a little bit more. And then I know you have a ton of ideas here specifically about storytelling. So I'm going to come back to that. When it comes to listening, one of the things that, the research I found when I was writing the book is when you're in a stressed state, which often many people in a difficult conversation are in a stressed state, your brain literally does not know how to collaborate, does not know how to be creative. It is like in fight or flight. I am not ready to have a dialogue, right? And so that's one of the key things that breathing can do is disrupt that fight or
Mhm,
flight. The other thing is asking a question
mhm,
can help the person you're talking with potentially also de-escalate. Because asking a question, when you're asked a question, it engages a different part of your brain. So I would say that's one of the reasons why you ask a question is to de-escalate and to give yourself space to also breathe and think about how do I calm down also. And so, I didn't know a lot of that before I went into to writing the book and really being aware that you don't want your brain to be hijacked. It's extremely important to pause and breathe,
mhm,
um, because that is like one of the number one things you can do to preserve a relationship.
mhm,
Now, I know, when we were talking and preparing for this, you had some great insights from women you've worked with in the past
mhm.
on de-escalating and listening. I'd love for you to share some of those as well and what you learned from your sponsor too.
Well, it's funny that you asked that, Jen, because I didn't even know she was a sponsor. This was many years ago. And the words sponsor and mentor, they were never discussed. And I was in a global healthcare organization at the time. And to this day, it's still at the top is old white men. And so I happen to have the only woman CEO in the entire organization as my boss. Um, and not only was she the only woman in the organization, she was the only diversity in the organization. That's how old this organization is. And I learned from her very early on. Um, I watched her handle some significantly bad situations in conversations, and I just learned from her. She taught me that when we struggle with difficult conversations, because we get caught up so much in who's right, who's wrong, right? And then we start thinking about how we can set them straight with the facts. This is why you should stop and think and
Yeah.
let your brain refocus. You're absolutely 100%. But there's a lot of emotion involved when you get into these conversations, and guess what? You're protecting your own self-image too, right? So I watched Joyce diffuse situations, and I thought, when I grow up, I want to be just like her. She was amazing. She just sat there and listened. But she didn't just listen. I mean, she wrote notes. She looked you straight in the eye the whole time. And she says, I understand. I don't understand that. Can you explain that? She just listened. And she really took in what everybody was saying. And she would always ask questions so she got everything right. And because, assumptions and perceptions can get in the way as well. And what I learned from her, and I come from an Italian family, was that going off is not the answer in this situation. And she taught me to be a better leader. I have to be honest with you. And I had some difficult people reporting to me at that time. And I used her technique. But I can also tell you that there were 5 of us that were direct reports to her, 3 women and 2 men. And she opened doors for all 3 of us, which I did not realize at the time. And she has been not only my sponsor, she has been the person I keep in my mind all the time, because that's what I do. I will open doors for women because I think it's important to bring women up with you. And that's what she also taught me.
I think it's fantastic to hear stories like that. I was very fortunate. My sponsor was a man, um, and he would go to bat for me when I wasn't in the room, right? Which is really
Mhm,
what you
mhm.
need and what you want. So when you're in the performance review meeting or your bosses, in this case, he was like 2 or 3 levels senior, it made a difference to my career. I mean, it escalated it in a positive way, it fast tracked, and so, for anyone listening, if you don't have a sponsor, whether you're male or female, but definitely
Yep.
female, make sure you have a sponsor.
Mhm.
Um, Now one of the things that you were talking about is the facts. And
They'll always get in the way.
they always get in the way. And one of the things in the research that I've done, one of the chapters is on politics.
Mhm.
And it's a husband, not husband, sorry. I'm thinking about my own husband in our political conversations. It's a father-daughter talking about politics. And there's a lot of research that shows when we start to have difficult conversations
Uh-huh.
about identity, um,
Mm.
that especially if it's politics or if you talk to someone about you don't like how they're showing up, or and you wouldn't say it that way, but when it becomes personal, when
Mhm.
it's about are they a good person because of, a choice they made or not,
Mhm.
the facts are not gonna help you because people will double down to preserve and protect their how they see themselves, just as you said. And so that's when we think about, going into conversations where they can be emotional, it's extremely important to think about how are you making them feel?
Mhm.
How do you keep it positive? Even if you're having a constructive conversation,
Mhm.
how do you keep it a we, not a, well, you need to do this, but um, making it that we're in this together, right?
Mhm.
So in some cases, I know um, for family, it might be I
A little
really care
bit.
about you. Right, right, it's some lead-in question, and so it really is important when we think about the facts that the facts can make someone double down on their perspective,
Mhm.
and so it's important to think about when you go into a difficult conversation, be very mindful of how you use them and when you use them, because oftentimes people we're way more emotional. We just rationalize our emotional decisions. We don't start rationally first. That is not what we're created to do. So, we talked about influencer and being a good influencer. What are
Mhm.
some things that behavior skills that women can leverage to be good influencers? And
Mm.
potentially, what are some of the unconscious biases that they might face that might keep them from being a good influencer that they need to think about?
You know, um, I think the important part here is that a good leader empowers others to lead, and you encourage them to achieve in that position. And I will give you a personal story on this as well. I had my sister-in-law and I went to college together. We were roommates. I didn't know she was going to be my sister-in-law at the time. But after they got married and she got into this big position in the government, um, she couldn't keep people to work for her. Now,
Mm,
fast forward, I'm with the hospital corporation and I'm learning from a woman who's teaching me how to empower people. And so one day I said to her, I says, Kathy, I don't think I understand. Why do they keep moving you around? Why can't you keep people? She goes, oh, they're no good. She goes, I had to fire them. I'm like, well, what did they do wrong? And at the end of the day, they were actually smarter than her and that intimidated her. So
mm,
they couldn't be a part of her team because she had to be the smartest person in the room. And so when you surround yourself with people that are yes people who are not going to make you shine, that's not a good leader. And you need people around you who actually know more than you and are there to make you shine, quite frankly. And you have to give them credit as well. So I think it's important that everybody that's in leadership understand that you need to empower the people around you and give them the credit. And I think the other part of this is as women, we're tough leaders. We have our own little unconscious bias about ourselves because we lack self confidence. We don't get a lot of that. So I think that as women, we need to actually know how to empower other women. And remember when I said bring women up with you?
mhm.
That just doesn't mean, handpicking people and moving them into positions. Empowered women empower women. And I think that's really important. I think you need to prioritize relationships. Relationships are critical to your success because that's how we women work. We are relationship people, and it's about advocating for your colleagues, amplifying other women, giving them the credit, but most of all, as a leader, leading by example. You know, and I think the big word that everybody's using today, the big sentence is know your own value, know your own worth. but make sure that the women that you are working with know their own worth too. So I just think that one of the critical successes for women is to empower more women into leadership.
Absolutely. I know we're getting ready to open up to Q&A. So if folks are watching, I'd love for you to drop comments in or questions. And Melissa, who is running the show behind the scenes from Rescue Event
Uh-oh.
Planning, has been fabulous. So she'll make sure we get the questions and we can answer those. Um, One of the things that I think is also challenging for women
Mhm,
is that we don't always have the same informal way of communication that men do. Specifically, and I'm thinking of, Tina Fox was one of the women that I interviewed for the book, and she and Donna Hoffman run an organization called Women on Course. And the idea is for, you know, women to learn how to get on the golf course comfortably, to be confident, because you need to be where a lot of those conversations are
uh-huh,
happening.
mhm,
And it's not just the golf course, but it's being cognizant that just because you're working hard, that does not mean you're going to get promoted or move up.
nope,
It's about all of these relationships and visibility, very intentional, very targeted. And golf is just one example of that. Can you think of some other examples or even a golf scenario where women need to also expand their informal networking and relationship building, not just, "Yes, I showed up to the meeting. Yes, it was a great meeting," but, like, outside of that, what comes to mind for you?
well, I think the most important thing outside of being able to have a great conversation is to know how to network and to really understand informal and formal networking. And informal networking is really powerful. You know, think about it. The guys are on the golf course and they're not talking about golf all the time. They're talking about, their career too. And all of a sudden, a new position or promotion falls into their lap. And where are the women? The back
Out
of
on the
the
out on the
office,
golf course.
putting their head down and working and waiting for someone to say, "Oh, look how busy she is." No, that's not gonna happen. Going to those informal networking, whether it's organized or unorganized, you need to get out there with informal networking and build your power network is what I call it. And that's having people who not only will they add value to your network, but you're gonna add value to their network. So networking is very powerful. I I preach that every single day that women need to know how to network and network right. And that doesn't mean going into a meeting with the friends you came with and never leaving that circle of friends because you're really not
Uh,
networking. Right?
yeah. No, no, totally. Absolutely. Well, and especially now that we're virtual for
Mhm.
probably another 2 to 6 months is my guess.
At least, yeah.
Informal networking is even more important. So how
Mhm,
are you finding opportunities to network within your company, outside of your company, with your peers, with
mhm,
where your clients might be,
mhm,
um, and if it's attending virtual events or if it's going to, you know, virtual happy hours, or maybe it's setting up your own event where you just start bringing people together once a month that you think should know each other, where you're the broker. But we do need to make sure in a virtual space, whether you're male or female, that you're thinking about, how do I approach difficult conversations virtually? How do I how am I visible now,
mhm, mhm,
virtually, informally and formally? Um, because a lot of those conversations that could have just been a water cooler conversation, we don't have a water cooler anymore. So not for a while anyway. So how do you create that in a virtual space, right? That's an important thing to think about. Um, Again, whether you're women or men, those difficult conversations, they're going to need to happen. So
mhm.
avoiding them is not going to do anybody any justice. Um, Proactively, getting out there. I also think, and you mentioned this earlier, having ongoing conversations with feedback
Mhm.
so that you're not really just sitting down once a year, but it's every month with your manager or with your direct reports so that there's not a surprise, right?
No,
It's
I
huge.
think those are really critical, but I also think that professional networking groups are important. And so belonging to an organization, and they are virtual meetings.
Yes.
And sometimes they're happy hour virtual meetings, and sometimes they're just foolish, but you really get to know people. I belong to the International Women's Forum, and I have to be honest with you. That has kind of saved my life during this pandemic because we do meet monthly, and it's a great group of women. And no, we don't solve the worries of the world, but you know what? We do talk about ourselves, and we pat each other on the back, and this is all good things. This is networking, and it's actually feels good to be around them. And that's just one group. I think that if you have friends from work, and obviously we're not going to the buildings anymore, that you can still have those conversations and do the networking on Zoom or Skype or whatever you want to do. And I think the last part is that we really do need to keep conversations going. I think it's vital, and that includes with your staff too.
Absolutely. So I have a couple of questions on it to you.
Okay.
What communication styles, and you mentioned a few earlier, um, cause the most complaints? So if you're a leader or you're managing up, sideways down, whether it's emotive, direct, or supportive or reflective, and we'll share these after the event as well.
Mhm.
Who causes the most complaints, and how do we think about that or approach that?
So you know this the answer to this. Yeah, that would be usually the director style, and those are people that are particularly very frank and assertive, whether they're a man or a woman. But again, that's a mixed bag too, because men can come across that way and women become bossy. So again, that is the emotive style, or excuse me, the director style, but for women it's called bossy. And that's unfortunate. But these are people that are pretty formal. And we talked about them earlier. They just pretty much don't admit they're wrong on top of it all. And so and they dominate the conversation. So it's difficult to have those conversations of any kind with them. So most of the time you just need to learn how to be diplomatic, but they would probably be the number one communication style that's the most difficult to be around. And they don't really care about the other three styles, by the way.
They're so inefficient. Who
They
cares?
are so efficient. This is the way it's going to go.
Yes. If your communication style is efficient, you may need to step back and
Yeah,
just think
definitely.
about, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And it may depend.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So if diversity is not on the radar for the CEO, what's the best way to bridge that gap?
Uh, I'm sorry. What do you mean by that?
So if the CEO, if it's not part of the strategic
Oh,
plan,
okay, got
or
it.
you want them to start moving in that direction, what's the best way for talking with the CEO about it, or just what can the CEO do as sort of step one?
Well, actually, I would have hopefully I was on the senior team. If I were on the senior team, then I would start the conversation amongst the senior team, and we as a group would approach the CEO because this would be a solution to the problem within an organization. And that's not to say there's a problem, so to speak, but I mean, this is how we are going to build a comprehensive strategy for the organization that includes gender equity. But if you're on your own and you're talking to your CEO, I would definitely bring up the pluses of why gender equity is so important. And remember when I said when you go in to have those conversations, you need to know the answer before you ask that question? You do need to do that. You need to be prepared for the pushback and him or her saying, we can't afford it. And you need to be able to come up with solutions that they're going to be able to at least digest in the first month. But I would consider it. That would be something I would bring up monthly in my meeting. But honestly, it's a joint effort.
Well, I think speaking in the language of the CEO, right?
Mhm,
Thinking about what matters to them,
mhm,
thinking about if they care about visibility, then this could be something they share in quarterly, communications. It
mhm,
could be something that
mhm,
helps attract talent if they're
mhm,
trying to attract and retain talent. It's one of the first times we've had 4 generations in the workforce,
mhm,
and diversity is huge. Um, as a consideration
Mhm.
for millennials thinking about where to work and will be for Gen Z as well. There's clear data on companies that have diverse employees, economic diversity, demographic, all kinds of diversity are more profitable. They do better on the stock market. Um, so I think there's a place where the profitability, even though I know that's a fact, but some of that information, might speak to the CEO looking at what competitors are doing, right?
Mhm.
Are we in front of competitors or are we behind and last? And I think that narrative now too, I think it's more obvious, hopefully, to organizations that they need to be discussing it. How far they dip their toe in the water, I'm not sure. But after this year, where it's really been front and center, my hope is that it's at least an easier talking point than maybe 12 months ago. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I agree with you 100%. But I think, when you're talking to the CEO, you have to talk their language, and their language is revenue.
Yes.
And so you need to remember, and you need to couch this in a really great way, is that the more women in leadership, the better the revenue. And that is a proven statistic. And you can bring that statistic to the table. So there are more women in leadership, you will have higher revenues. And of course, if the woman is a CEO, that's even better. And that also goes to the boardroom. If you have more than 3 women in your boardroom, you also will see a difference in your bottom line revenues as well. So it's really critical that women be in positions of leadership because it does positively affect the bottom line.
100%. And I'm not saying that because I'm biased at all. Um, I mean, I love that we're having all of these conversations. I think we do need to see action from the top down.
Yep.
Um, there's a data point. I forget if it was in the Confidence Gap or where I read it, but um, that if we stayed on our current pace of change,
Hmm.
women would not have pay equity or gender equity as far as in leadership positions for 100 years,
Yep.
which is just depressing.
It's very depressing, and that statistic was just done at AAUW. And if we continue on this path, none of us will be around to see it. That's the sad part. And for those of us that are raising sons and daughters, it's very sad, because our sons are just as important to helping them empower women as anybody else.
Well, and I have 2 sons and a husband, and I'm the only female in the house besides my dog. I did choose a female dog on purpose. Um, but that is a hard conversation on the home front,
Mhm,
talking about
mhm.
and explaining what it feels like because they don't have that perspective. That's not what they experience. I was joking with you earlier about we were watching the Cash Cab, which every once in a while we watch because it's fun. And the Cash Cab is a New York cab show where you answer questions and earn money. And there were 4 people who got in the cab, 3 men, 1 woman. And the woman kept getting all the answers right, and the 3 men kept ignoring what she was saying. They'd finally come around and say, "Oh, you know what? You are right. Let's listen to you." But it took them a while to get there instead of just listening. And she would quietly say the answer, and they would keep talking. And my husband was like, "Oh my gosh, just listen to the woman. She's been right this whole time." And I was like, "There you go. That is what I'm talking about." Right? When there aren't enough women in the room to
I think
support
that's
each other
a
and
perfect
to
answer.
speak up, right? And I saw this light bulb go off for him, um, because he really saw a tangible example, right?
Mhm.
And I think the more tangible it is, the more we can share those stories to help men and women understand why this matters, and the better. So, I know we're right at time.
Yeah, it
This
looks that
has
way.
been fabulous. I really
Thank you so much.
appreciate you taking the time, and we covered a lot of stuff. So this will be recorded. We'll make it available. Um, I did do a drawing to see who of our registrants on Eventbrite gets a signed copy. So that is Olga. So I will be reaching out and
Oh, cool.
getting her address and sending her a signed copy. I'm getting a large shipment of my books later this week, so those will be going out in the mail. But thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. I know you did takeaways for us, so I'll compile those and get those out as well. Where can people connect with you? Where would you want them to go? What's a good way for them to reach out? I know we're putting some of your info up there, but
Yeah, I see it going across
what's your
the
preferred
verbiage.
style?
Yes, no, no, please. Yeah, you can reach me at jan@aspire-ascend.com. I'm on Twitter. I am on Facebook. I can't imagine Instagram as well. So, and our Facebook page, or excuse me, our website is www.aspire-ascend.com. So join us. Thank you. This has been so great. It's a great
Thank
conversation.
you. Thank you very much. I could talk with you all day long. Just as a last reminder, my ebook is up on Amazon. It's 99 cents only this week because it came out on Tuesday, and just to celebrate that, it's 99 cents. It'll go
Wow.
to 9.99 next week. So make sure you grab your copy. The print versions are ready as well. I ordered mine this week and it showed up, so I have a physical copy. Could be a great holiday stocking stuffer. So think about that. These are important muscles we need to build, how to have difficult conversations. They're not going to get any easier and they're not going to go away. So thank you, Jan, again. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll see everybody online next week for next week's Meet the Author series.